Good evening. My name is Lucía M. Polis. I wrote the following talk on the theme of trust as part of the CreativeMornings initiative, which issues themes to its chapters around the world to create discursive spaces around various themes. The talk that you are about to hear was recorded by me and by members of the Victoria Arts Council on July 26, 2024. Despite a lot of back and forth with the VAC, this talk has still not been published after 220 days, missing the opportunity to be part of the larger thematic discussion and inadvertently proving that institutions stifle creators and their creations, which I think is one of the main points of this talk. Poetry and trust. Just for fun, I'd like to begin with a quote from William Blake. Quote, "I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's. I will not reason and compare. My business is to create." Unquote. The connection to this perspective will become clear in just a moment. For now, I think it is a very fortuitous coincidence that the theme of this series is trust, because this concept is not only central to the composition, practice, sharing, and publishing of poetry, but is absolutely essential to it, especially today. The first question that comes to mind is, can I write poetry? For me personally, this question was answered when, in September of 1996, some 27 years ago, I first wrote a poem in English, chronologically my fourth language, in Ms. Barthel's grade 9 English class. The teacher had simply asked each student in the class to fill in a form with nouns, adjectives, and verbs, and then, as if by magic, you got a poem out of it. It's hard to say whether my personal obsession with poetry had stemmed from neurodivergence or a predisposition towards languages, but if there's one thing that is certain, it's that I attribute my growth, my success as a poet, to this notion of trust in self. Yes, I said to myself, I could write poetry. Now keep in mind that there were a myriad things I did not trust myself with. What to choose for my university studies, what career to pursue, what kind of people to befriend, what kind of things to believe in, what kind of person to be. However, it is neither a miracle nor a coincidence that poetry, throughout these past 3 decades of my life, has been the only space where I could foster a nascent, closeted queerness, or an undiscovered neurodivergence, or a love for symmetry and synchrony. This is precisely the kind of trust that today I wish to instill in those who submit poems to JLRB Press, the poetry imprint I founded last year. However, before we dive into the story, let's have a peek at other forms of trust that have been haunting poetry and would-be poets for a very long time. Beyond my trust in self, the first issue I quickly encountered in my literature classes were the twinned notions of trust in genre and the misplaced trust in understanding the text. It is supremely ironic in retrospect, and I've observed this firsthand during my short tenure as a university lecturer, that despite having encountered numerous poetic forms and examples throughout the given high school class or university term, too many individuals remain in either dumbstruck awe or a highly suspicious mood whenever a teacher or a professor explicates a poem. The problem here was, and frankly continues to be, that the majority of us are taught that poetry is the privileged language of the few, akin to Walter Benjamin's reine Sprache, pure language, that only some inner circle of high-ranking diplomats is entitled to interpret. For more than a decade now, there's been a sort of meme floating around that shows a poorly designed Venn diagram with the left circle indicating what the author meant and the right circle indicating what the English teacher thinks the author meant. Underneath, the caption states, for instance, "The curtains were blue." Further down, another set of captions clarifies what your teacher thinks. "The curtains represent his immense depression and his lack of will to carry on." What the author meant. The curtains were fucking blue. There's a terrible exasperation in this image, and it makes me wonder what the author of this infographic would think of the conclusion of Archibald MacLeish's Ars Poetica that ends with, quote, "A poem should not mean, but be," unquote. It makes me wonder what they might have thought when informed of the death of the author, or when introduced to the old new criticism, and then suddenly shown the magic and danger of theory. But of course, this is beside the point. How can someone enjoy exploring the beat poets or Shakespeare's sonnets if this person is so preoccupied with the senseless desire to understand, which is a priori both unreachable and irrelevant to poetry? Worse yet, suppose that you got the luck of the draw and not only had teachers who convinced you to enjoy the sense and function of poetry rather than dissect its meaning. Suppose also that you admitted to yourself that poetry is something you could try your hand at. Well, it's all trust issues all the way down from here on out. Don't get me wrong, just because the interpretation and enjoyment of poems could be liberated, which I believe ought to have always been as free and as open as possible, it doesn't mean that its institutional production and consumption were not also regulated by those same forces that either prevent people from writing today or have in fact stultified all writing as a creative practice before one ever gets a chance to grow as a writer in earnest. I don't know if I believe literally in the 10,000 hour rule, but I have written more than 1,000 poems. No more than 30% of these are probably palatable, and that's the point. I do know that poetic ability comes from praxis, from the mindful adoption of art, not only as a filter from one's experiences, but also as a measured medium of expression that requires a dogged pursuit of drafting, editing, and revising of art as work. I do certainly believe in the notion of Kaizen, or continuous improvement. The problem with both these notions, however, is that, we're going to apply a little Marxist theory here, they both require either a form of leisure or at least time away from work, because there is much to say about composition and creation in solitude, something that isn't readily available to those who must devote their waking days either to work or to rest from it. It's not that poetry wasn't ever written outside of the nobility or the middle class. There are plenty of oral traditions happening well into the 20th century. But it's that its appreciation as a rarefied medium for thought was slowly restricted to specific periodicals and publications. Over time, this is particularly apparent even today if you're asked to design an introduction to English literature course and forced to pick an anthology. A sort of feedback loop arises in which little by little those outlets that began to publish poetry had eventually created standards for what they wished to put out into the world. Submission criteria aren't a bad idea. However, the more people wrote and submitted, the more these standards were tightened and constrained so that successive cohorts of outsiders would emerge and would self-publish their own early work. William Blake, Walt Whitman, Gertrude Stein, D.H. Lawrence, Virginia Woolf, Ezra Pound, E.E. Cummings, whose collection was actually titled No Thanks, alluding to his numerous rejections, Diane di Prima, Anne Waldman, and so on. And these authors then found or funded new publications or periodicals, which would lock out a new generation and so on ad infinitum. It wouldn't be an issue if these outlets had remained populist, but something that we can observe quite often is that some of the most common tendencies of institutions come from a need to legitimize, defend, and sustain themselves. And this involved creating a sense of mythos, exclusivity, nebulousness, and gravitas. As this effect becomes more and more pronounced and amplified over the decades, it simply adds fuel to the fire of fear that emerges once more each time an inspiring poet would submit a piece of writing, often paying real money for the privilege of submission to, in the worst case, simply never hear back, or in the best case, receive an unhelpful form letter that would begin and end with, "Unfortunately, your work isn't suitable to our catalog of publications." What could you have done better? You'd never know. What trust? If you've tried your hand at poetry for the past 3 to 4 decades, you must have tasted the bitterness of these rejections that have done nothing to add to the improvement of your craft, have done nothing to create or uplift a creative community, but had simply slammed a door in your face over and over again until you simply stopped submitting. Thus, the trust in the self becomes lost. The trust in being read, seen is lost, and the trust in the publishing industry as a whole, let alone the literary community, disappears. Today, it can feel almost as if we return to the 1800s or the early 1900s. According to data collected by Dmitry Kurchik, between 2004 and 2007, about 10 poetry books accounted for more than 22% of all poetry sales. Examining the poetry sales market in 2022, we can see that it became almost half of what it once was in 2004. So much for the trust in the genre. This is incidentally why the Latin motto of JLRB Press is litera scripta fugit, a play on the maxim commonly attributed to the Roman poet Horace, who claimed that the written word remains. Our take is that the written word flees, if not treated with the utmost respect and care. And still, at present, among publishers, both independent and established, poetry is seen as one of the worst-selling genres of creative writing, an inherent risk. So much for the trust in the author. So why are publishers still charging any submission fees for poetic entries? Why do large poetry publishers continue to send form letters or stonewall submitters? What impetus is there for a person to write when the first consideration that a publisher gives to a manuscript or a handful of poems for an anthology is whether the writing can sell, not whether it can reach an audience, form a basis for a creative community, inspire mentorship and learning? I was 42 when I founded JLRB Press last year. It wasn't done on a whim. I'll share a secret with you. When I had self-published my first poetry collection, Granville, in 2005, whose 25th anniversary edition I hope to put out next year, I had on a whim inscribed JLRB Press on the title page. This notion, this dream of creating my own poetry outlet has haunted me for 2/3 of my poetic career thus far. But then, when time came to put out We Were Hateful People, I asked myself, would I rather publish this book as a one-off and scratch that itch and call it a day? Or would I rather do it as a proof of concept, put a little trust in my abilities, see what it might take to put together a ragtag, self-funded organization, and see how far this could get us? I wasn't wrong to try. 1 year, 5 months, and 13 days later, now about 2 years, JLRB Press has put out 4 books of poetry, one of them an anthology with 30 authors across Canada and the US. Building on every concern I have just mentioned, I set out to operate on a number of principles that underscored my desire to trust in the mission I had set out for ourselves. The first principle that I was adamant about is that JLRB Press would receive no funding whatsoever from any government, educational, or otherwise institutional organization. And in fact, the $300 honorarium given for this unpublished talk has now been given away to more deserving organizations that support poets and poetry. As an English PhD who has spent nearly a decade and a half in academia, I decided pretty quickly that I would be funding the press entirely by myself. I also decided that the press would never charge for submission or admission for any book launch, performance, or event. It simply didn't align with our ethos of removing cultural barriers from an art form that many already eye with suspicion. I will admit I wanted to offer the option of hybrid publishing, but we have observed too many vanity and predatory presses fleecing authors of thousands of dollars only to release a book that no one would ever read. What's disappointing is that a cursory Google search will reveal that many established book publishers have shifted to the hybrid model, which they operate as a vanity press. We toyed with the idea but never pursued hybrid publishing in earnest. We also made a point of being very clear about the ways in which we protect our authors' rights. All agreements must be renewed after 5 years. The author always retains the copyright and moral rights to their work. We register the Canadian copyright and provide the author with a copy of the certificate. We make no claim to any subsidiary rights. We remain transparent about royalties from book sales, and we even pay our authors a small bonus if they make a bestseller list or win an award. Like any new enterprise, we're not expecting JLRB Press to break even until at least 2027. But this is really beside the point, because sales, profits, and popularity have never been the drivers of our selection process. And to put it bluntly, we decided from the outset to never be shy about investing in authors and books that we care about. At present, it's not unusual for us to spend as much as $4,000 on preparing, promoting, and printing the first run of a book. Even if we only make a portion of this amount back, because we know with an absolute certainty that every copy we print has been held, touched, and read by people who love poetry, who take an active interest in it. In addition to these internal principles, we've also committed to certain external principles, which we discuss openly on the press's website. The first of these espouses and recuperates the concept of trust between poets and publishers more than any aspect of what we do. It took some time to train the editors of the press in this art, but unlike just about any press out there, we write detailed, constructive feedback to every submitter, regardless of acceptance. I've been developing what I call a 3+2 technique, where each editor, who also espouses a vertical structure in which every member of the editorial board performs a portion of various activities for the press, every editor is obliged to open a submission response with a detailed overview of 3 striking things about the submitted work, followed by 2 areas of improvement, for improvement with no exceptions. True enough, no one likes rejection, but I don't think I've ever seen more gratitude from poetry submitters who are normally resigned to indiscriminate and inexplicable rejection, and who in this case have been excited and enthralled by our analyses, suggestions, feedback, and ideas about their work. Here and there, we've entered into further dialogue with authors, which has on occasion fostered a nascent community of ideas, and which has already grown into a virtual workshop series we've recently inaugurated with a webinar on self-editing, followed by a webinar on scansion. One essential aspect of our submission response methodology is that, unlike other publishers who permit submissions to disappear into bureaucratic black holes for months, we have made a commitment to acknowledge every submission within 2 business days, and to respond to each submission within 4 business weeks. In many ways, this close communication helps remove the veil from some of the obscure publishing practices that not only unnecessarily mystify the entire process, but also create doubts and delays. For example, when it comes to simultaneous submissions. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. To ensure that we hold ourselves to the highest possible standard, as chief editor, I work to anonymize all submissions to prevent unconscious bias, and our editors do not receive any information from the submission form until the response is already written. To help engage the authors, our work doesn't end after the submission response and feedback are sent. We keep the door open for authors to follow up and, most importantly, to resubmit their revised manuscripts during our next open submission period. In essence, we have devised a system that can grant either acceptance for publication or what I like to call a soft rejection, with an option to resubmit again. And a handful of authors are already taking us up on this offer. It bears mentioning how much we ourselves as editors have been learning from all this along the way. Every once in a while, with an associate editor might get stumped. We might take a one-on-one meeting to hash out and discuss how certain metrical or figurative poetic principles work within a given submission. We have a chat channel in which we provide peer feedback. On occasion, we might debate heatedly a manuscript that we feel particularly strongly about. Or we might lose ourselves in research and questions to the author in service of understanding a submission better. Perhaps one of the most striking examples of this comes from S. Rupsham Mitra, whose limited edition debut collection, Smoked Frames, I had accepted for publication and edited. It turned out to be very different things. On the one hand, to read Homi Bhabha in the rarefied air of a graduate school classroom and to pontificate on subaltern voices, and on the other hand, to suddenly find myself corresponding with a young poet from Kolkata whose voice I suddenly realized I had to amplify without erasing. Those grueling 3 months in which I felt like I learned hundreds of things about Indian literature and culture were also among some of the most humbling learning experience I've ever had. While I had something to teach Rupsha about lineation and meter, she had lots to teach me about concepts I haven't even considered from the standpoint of my own upbringing, social position, and gender. Indeed, it was striking to see feminism operating from within a traditional cultural milieu, and the ways in which it succeeded or was challenged, but so was observing more familiar narratives with a new twist, such as exploration of womanhood, proscribed sensuality, and coming of age. Regardless even of the success of the book, it goes without saying that this unique situation created a rare opportunity for mutual learning that I wouldn't have otherwise encountered as readily outside of academia. I'll mention one more anecdote from the recent past. It so happened that I had made a mistake and overextended myself when editing one of the poems in an anthology we've put out this past May. When one of the authors reached out to me, they were very upset with the edited version of the poem, and rightfully so. Taking a cue from past relationships and experiences, I created a space in which the author and I could not only freely discuss the needed changes without acrimony, but also work up a significantly more effective edit of the poem, which I ended up inserting by hand as an errata sheet into 150 copies of the book as my own penance. I don't believe there are many publishers out there, let alone small independent ones, that would take as many pains as we do when we try to build trust with our authors, even in the face of errors. And this is precisely the kind of ethos we want to create for those who might operate their own imprints. The more, the merrier. Of course, the final element of trust exists between myself, the founder of the press, and its staff, comprised entirely of volunteers. I couldn't be more proud of the work that my colleagues such as Hannah and James, who have been with the press for 1 year, have done, especially while helping vet and compile the first anthology. Holes, a collection of poems about depths, darkness, and desire. And I'm thankful for the collaboration that I've had with contributors such as CJ, who have helped shape the form for future anthologies. With each day, we find small ways to learn from each other in ways that I often no longer notice in everyday working environments, hurried and harried by the pressure to produce. All that remains is gratitude, and my hope that over time we will continue to redefine the space within which we collaborate with authors and with each other and continue to make our own time and our own rules. Thank you.